Hello. Welcome back to the show, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you. If you're just meeting me, my name's Christine. And today we are finally reaching a topic that has been very hard for me to talk about. I don't think I was planning on ever talking about it, but as I've concluded the integration phase of my ayahuasca journey a few months ago and continued the healing from it and what was revealed to me, I've realized that part of my journey is actually having the courage to transmute aspects of painful parts of my life and put it to purpose in the hope it can help other people in some way. And I'm going to talk to you in detail today about my experiencing the father wound and specifically childhood abuse, and specifically from someone who had all three of the personality types that are part of something called the dark triad, and that's narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. There's a trigger warning with this episode that a lot of what I share may feel uncomfortable for people. But I know at the same time what's been most healing for me, I can't tell you how many self-development books I've read over the last 11 years, like definitely one a month for 10, 11 years, sometimes 2 a month. Usually I have 4 on the go at once. But and every time it's nonfiction and self-development. But what has stood out is recently I've been reading memoirs. And they've been more healing to me than anything, because it's like you can learn about something and you can have names for a certain kind of abuse you experienced. But when you actually hear someone find the courage to reveal the details, the actual nuances of, okay, I get it. If you have a narcissistic parent, they do X, Y, or Z. You can read about the dictionary example, but it doesn't feel as healing as learning the actual real life example that you might be able to relate quite a lot to. And in relating to someone else who's experienced trauma, it helps us feel not alone. It helps us feel like we're not the only one out there that something like this happened to. And there's something about that, even though you might never meet the person, it just helps you soften the sting, so to say. So that's my intention here. My intention is to honor the voice of my inner child who always felt no one would believe her because I was the child and my father was the adult, but also give voice to other adult survivors of childhood abuse and help them feel less alone. And I'm also going to put a spiritual twist on things to give you hope at the end of the tunnel and find healing. And I'm going to tie in a lot of my experience on my recent ayahuasca journey. I'll be sharing details of what happened in my 3rd and 4th night of ceremony. But before I get to that element of things, I think we need to first kind of dive into the actual experience of what it felt like, what happened growing up with my abusive father. So first, I'm going to acknowledge that one of the cruelest forms of psychological abuse in psychology is that of narcissistic abuse. And a steroid version of that is if you're also being placed in the role of family scapegoat. Why it's viewed as one of the most painful forms, and this isn't from my subjective perspective, this is what you'll learn from when you study or learn from psychologists specialized in this field of FSA. That's the acronym, Family Scapegoat Abuse. There's an expert in the field who wrote a brilliant book on it named Dr. Rebecca. You can find her on YouTube. But there's so many experts, esteemed psychologists on YouTube you can also learn from. Just simply type in family scapegoat abuse and they'll probably describe it 10 times better than me. But anyways, why it's one of the most painful forms is it doesn't stop at simply the physical incident. There might be a certain dysfunctional parent who hits their kids or smacks them across the face or belts them. But with the element of scapegoat abuse, it actually poisons and infiltrates the entire family system, and even the extended family system. And it's passed down from generation to generation unless the victim, the scapegoat, says no more. Now, the only chance the victim is going to say no more is if they actually gain enough awareness and see above the veil of the veil of consciousness. As long as they're operating with less awareness, which is also like less consciousness, like a smaller scope of understanding, they won't grasp this, and they'll actually continue to be stuck in this sick, and when I say sick, I mean like mentally sick family system. And 2 years ago, when I realized the situation I was in was actually narcissistic abuse, I found the courage to leave that relationship. But what really became apparent is like, oh wow, I thought I was doing self-care and self-love for the last 10 years. You know, my awakening was like 11 years ago at this time. Like I thought I thought I did the healing. I thought I was on the path. But the ending of that relationship was very illuminating for me. Certainly a spiritual teacher. Like it was definitely like a divine planned relationship to bring to my awareness, oh, there are deep unconscious patterns here that are being perpetuated in the kinds of partners I'm attracting. And it's going to like become so apparent to a point you have to face what you've repressed and actually never dug into and healed. Where am I going to go with this? Well, basically, I guess it was at this time that I started learning more about how the abuse cycle I was perpetuating with men was not by accident or by chance. It's just a non-negotiable side effect that happens to adult survivors of childhood abuse. It's not some sort of thing like, I got lucky, I married the perfect man, and you know, my friend didn't, and she has like, you know, someone who's not nice to her. It's not luck of a draw. It's actually attraction, energetic attraction. There's it's all vibration. The universe, this construct we live in, this game we live in, it's run on vibration. And everything has a vibration, including belief systems, including subconscious ones. Conscious ones, sure. Unconscious ones, like our subconscious mind dominates our life. It's ruling most of our life. Some people say 95%. So if we've downloaded some conscious programming into our hardwiring about our worth and value during our formative years with our family of origin, we're going to see that play out mirrored in our adult romantic relationships. And there's no running from that without doing the work, without the painful shadow work, without doing the things that often we want to avoid. And so to avoid them, we find a vice or something that distracts us. And you want to know what mine was? It was alcoholism. The second I tried alcohol and I got buzzed, I can look back and say that 15-year-old me, 14-year-old me was immediately addicted. And I didn't actually think that at the time. I just thought like, oh, wow, I love this. I love this feeling. But the feeling was actually so good to me. It felt euphoric because there was freedom and escape from the trauma that I was too young to process, so I disassociated from it, particularly how extreme it got. And we're talking extreme. But I was, my brain, like there was no way I was resourced to process what was happening day in and day out, living with my father. So I completely disassociated out of my body and then discovered booze shortly thereafter, and always said, oh, I just have fun with my friends. We just like partying. We have a good time. And I always just chalked up the drinking to, well, it's fun. And then it became clear in my later 20s, well, why do I still really crave it, whether or not my friends are here, whether or not I'm going out with them, whether or not we're having a party? Why is something in me craving to go get my pack of beer on the way home from work? What is something in me that's saying like, no, don't stop at the liquor store? But something inside me was stronger saying, oh, you stop at the liquor store, right? For those who don't know, I'm over 7 years sober now, and I kicked that addiction at 32. Self-development started at 39, shortly after realizing I was addicted. But yeah, anyways, in the journey of trying to get sober and then being sober, all the traumas have surfaced. All of the feelings that were too big to feel when I was, 5 all the way to 16, they have come to the surface for attention. And so what became clear in one of these, 2 years ago, I took a program, a narcissistic trauma recovery program. Her name's Carolyn Strawson, who provided it. She's one of the experts in the field. Taking that program, it became, very clear that I was born into what is considered a toxic and narcissistic family system. And at that time, I also devoured the work by John Bradshaw, who's the pioneer in psychology, and he really brought forth in the 80s. And there's you can find on YouTube, if you Google John Bradshaw family systems, there's 100 hours of free videos. It's a series that once was on the public, PBS, public broadcasting station, and he actually teaches how the whole family has different roles. There might be one or even both toxic parents or narcissistic parents. It's very common one or both will be alcoholics, and then they'll often be, if both children aren't abused, it's more common they'll actually be one scapegoat and one golden child if there's two. And so the love and time and energy and resources will be provided to one, and there'll be a sense of feeling good about themselves, the parent, based on what they pour into one child, and there'll be enmeshment with that child, and often that child will later, there'll be a lot of enabling. That child will stay enmeshed with that parent often later in life, but then what happens to the other child, that's where all the family's shame, that's the key thing with this concept of family systems, is there's generational trauma that's being passed down from parent to next generation, and every time it doesn't actually get addressed and healed and resolved with a new program, a new patterning, a new reactive behavior to the next child, it just goes on and on and on and on and on. And because we're in this age of Aquarius, where so many people have had their spiritual awakening and they're choosing to be better, to do the inner work, to learn and grow and actually be the best version of themselves, to let go of vices that are hindering them, there's probably more family scapegoats than there ever have been, who are not staying in that role, but transcending it and becoming the truth teller in the family. They're seeing the distortion. They're seeing this doesn't make sense. They have wisdom beyond their years. They're the child in the family who feels like they know more than the adults in the family. They're the child who sees why can't my parents just stop drinking and we wouldn't have so much chaos? There's a common sense that they can see that it seems like the family of origin is blind to. But because there's so much unprocessed trauma from the grandparent to, the next child to, and so on and so forth, the lineage is just, brimming with shame. That's the commonality. And when someone isn't processing their internal shadow and all of their trauma and anger, there might be so much unconscious self-hatred, and it has to go somewhere. And it's going to be projected. This is part of a trait of having narcissism, is you project outwardly to your target your unprocessed shame. So if someone might act like they think they're so great, but then behind closed doors, they verbally abuse someone and put them down and just demean them and are crazy critical against that person to try and destroy their self-esteem, how is that person doing that? What made them be so mean? That's the question. And certainly the child who doesn't understand what's going on will feel this doesn't make sense. I'm so confused. Why is my parent trying to tell me I'm all these awful things? The most common phrase I was told every day of my life by my dad was, "You're a worthless piece of shit." That was multiple times a day. And starting before I went through puberty, but it really got, I'm going to say constant once I was going through puberty, was you're a little slut just like your mother. There was so much sexual shaming of me going through puberty, making fun of me, humiliating me when he saw I got my period, and some of it had dropped on the carpet in my bedroom when I stood up out of bed. And he once discovered my underwear that I had got as I was going through puberty, vaginal discharge in, which is a normal thing that happens to a 13-year-old girl. But he made fun of me and shamed me and called me disgusting for these things. And this was while never providing me with pads or tampons or underwear hadn't been bought for me beyond being in elementary. So to try to fit underwear on my body during this time, I had to cut old bathing suits or really old gym suits from when I was like 7, 8 years old in half. And I wore like the bottom half. I stretched it out and I wore that as a way to like fit underwear over my bum, because there was none of those things provided. So like I said, there's going to be so much shame in the dysfunctional parent. And because they're not able to process it, they're going to pick one of the children to throw it all on. And likely the parents themselves hate each other and have a dysfunctional relationship. And in my case, I became like, it's like my mother. I mean, I'm not even going to talk about my experience with my mother today, because that's its own concept called the mother wound. But my mother used to be his target when they were together. Well, they were each other's targets because they both have narcissism, but it's different. Like my dad is part of the dark triad, but my mom is a covert narcissist, but both were alcoholics growing up. So, but he'd always call her a slut. And then it makes sense that when she no longer was living with him, then I was the slut of the house. But then when you understand family systems, my sister wasn't a slut, only I was a slut. And so it's really fascinating when you learn the family system work, and you can see like, oh, everyone's literally playing their part in how this dysfunction plays out, you know? So if we want to change what we attract, we have to first find the courage to face the experiences that shaped our model and belief systems of the world. You know, like that is a non-negotiable. There's also something called family constellation work, and you can Google that, and maybe you can even, if you're interested in it, you can find a practitioner, because that is along the same line of thought as family systems. So this isn't unique to just my family of origin. This happens to all families where there's generational trauma. I know there was in mine because, like, I don't know anything about my grandparents. I don't even know my grandpa's names on either side. Like, that's how, like, fractured off the family is. But what I do know, the little bit I do know, is that my grandpa was an alcoholic, a bad one, and that he died in a car accident drinking, and that I assume he was violent because I learned just recently he fractured my grandma's jaw. So it's like every time I gather like a little bit more information about my family tree, it almost connects the dots, and it's like, oh, this makes sense. Oh, it makes sense. And I see why as a soul I chose to incarnate into such a family off track in evolution, because I know like this isn't going to be a victim story here, by the way. It's going to get really good at the end, but we're going to have to go through some of the sludge to get there. But I know, and I'm going to assure you on a soul level, I had a choice and I chose this family of origin, and that I believed in how much power I wielded based in light and love and truth and what actually is true. I believe I had so much conviction in that it gave me the bravery to say, I'm ready to incarnate into that lineage, and that lineage needs the most transformation. That lineage needs the greatest amount of awakening and light infiltrating into it to change what's happening. And it has been. My daughter will never know. My daughter will never know this abuse. The cycle ended at me. And as I share more of my story, you'll see and grasp more how. So it's, yes. So when these things happen, it's not unique to just my family. It's any family that has unprocessed generational trauma, addiction, alcoholism, physical, emotional abuse, one or more parents, etc. So as I mentioned, my father meets the criteria of Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and high-grade narcissism. The things done to me under his roof meet criteria for all, and in some cases meet criteria for criminal charges. This is a very profound experience for me to have the courage to say these things out loud for the very first time in my life as a 39-year-old woman. Okay, so growing up, I'm gonna jump off this story of kind of sharing what was going on when my parents got divorced. My parents got divorced when I was 8. They had a very violent, toxic relationship. They'd stay up all night screaming, violent. There was like physical violence. They'd literally chase each other around the house. I wouldn't fall asleep at night because of the screaming. And they would just stay up getting drunk together all night. It was like they were in a a war, and we had this gross, decrepit little bungalow, and they would just do that like repeat. They never slept in the same bed, and the feeling was they hated each other. So I understood why they got divorced. And to kind of put my experience like in a quick summary is there was no parental involvement in my life. So I stopped getting a babysitter at 6 years old. So at that age onward, or like it would be then 7 onward, when I'd wake up in the morning, no one would be home. They would have already gone to work. And so I'd wake up by myself at 8:30. I'm young. I'm not responsible. I'm only 7. So I'd never leave myself enough time to make breakfast. So I should actually mention, I never learned how to make myself breakfast. I never acquired the habit. It was never like shown to me, so I just never did it. So the first time I learned to start feeding myself breakfast, I was a 24-year-old woman, and I did it because my boyfriend at the time ate breakfast, and I was like, oh, I'll try eating breakfast. I just never have. Like, there's no memory of eating breakfast in my life. Like, there's no such thing as like eating a family breakfast on the weekend. I actually never ate a meal at a dinner table with my family. My first time doing that was when I was placed into a foster family at 16. We ate dinner at a table together. But I kind of flash forwarded later in the story. But just to give you a sense of like the level of like parental non-involvement. So my parents were still living together when I was 7, but it was just complete chaos. And so I was really just on my own, and there wasn't enough money for me to like be put into something extracurricular. And so, I would do crazy things that were, I look back and think like, oh my gosh, she was so resourceful, because I did whatever I could to try to gather money so that I could do gymnastics. My parents always told me there's only enough money for one of you to do a sport, and so it's going to be your sister doing skating. So I remember being 7, and there was no rule of like, you can't go out on the street alone, you can't go to the park alone. Like there was no like concept of like, don't walk out the door past 8 p.m. It was just like, no one had a clue about me. So I just took it upon myself one night to go door to door begging for money. I was 7, it was already dark out, and I needed to raise money as my own little fundraiser to gather enough to go to gymnastics. My friends were in gymnastics. I knew I loved it. I saw it on TV. I wanted to be a gymnast. It was my dream to go to the Olympics. And I remember people were shocked. They looked at me and they'd like scurry around, try and find like a quarter, a loonie, a toonie. And one woman was so shocked, she immediately like intervened and made sure I got home. And she said to me, little girl, what are you doing? Like, why are you outside? It's dark. You can't be here by yourself. And I remember something about that memory like stood out in my brain of thinking like, oh, why am I out? Like something cued my attention of like, should a parent maybe be aware of me? Because like, you don't know what you don't know when this is the environment you're raised in. But nevertheless, like I said, my soul chose it. I have so many gifts later in life from gaining such an early level of resourcefulness and independence and just like figuring things out, so to speak. And you'll hear those stories as we go. To give you another kind of example of this childhood home, I felt I was wise above my years always. And I remember thinking, like, it doesn't make sense that Santa exists. Like, I got to get to the bottom of this. I got to figure this out. So I believed in him when I was 5. But at 6 years old, I found some plastic watches from the dollar store, and it was Christmas Eve, and I found them in my mom and dad's closet. So I asked my mom, what are these? Like, basically I was like trying to like clarify, like, are these going to be from Santa? Why are they already here? I was trying to get to the root of the matter. I was already questioning things, which is so how I now am as an adult, always questioning the norm and being inquisitive. And I actually appreciate that attribute about myself, but definitely wasn't okay. Growing up, I got in an enormous amount of trouble. I got told that I ruined Christmas. I was shamed, yelled at, and put in my room alone for the rest of the night on Christmas Eve. So that was another early sign of the amount of like shaming and emotional immaturity of the adults toward me, the child. I also at this time was downloading this belief like, oh, my needs don't actually matter. One of my fundamental core beliefs that I downloaded was I don't get what other people get, that like my needs aren't as important. And basically if there's time, energy, or resources, it will go to the other girl, the other woman. So when we moved into our house in Glen Allen in Sherwood Park, for those who know where that is, I remember my sister got her bedroom like all set up for a little girl. So she would have been 7, and she got the walls painted nice and white and a unicorn border put up. And it's like, me as Nevi's mom, I can't tell you how much I love doing anything that would make her heart sing, making anything that would make her bedroom feel special for her. I mean, I would walk through fire to do anything to bring a smile to my child's face. And it's not a chore, it's not an inconvenience. But what happened to me is like, it wasn't one of the physical abusive moments that absolutely took off shortly, but it was this core belief of, oh, I'm not worthy of being treated the same as other people. I don't deserve it. So my bedroom had 2 different kinds of wallpaper in it from the 60s, and both had this like gross, like mustardy yellow kind of thing, but were also peeling. So you saw this like gluey background, and it looked like a room you'd enter if you were like, it gave the feeling of like when you enter a crack house and there's like torn wallpaper on the walls, but then that gluey background. That was my bedroom, and it mortified me. I love aesthetics and making an environment look beauty. That's just in my beautiful. That's just in my nature. And so to have a bedroom that looked like it was for like this old person, but also with torn wallpaper, I was actually quite embarrassed about it. And I'm 4 years old, right? So I begged my parents to also decorate my room, and it never happened. I lived in that house from 4 until I was removed by police at 16. And there was never a weekend, a 2-hour time frame where the wallpaper was pulled off and a slab of paint was put on. I would actually hope and pray to God for help with my room. I know that sounds like, really, was your room that important? And it was. When you're 4, you don't know problems of the world. You know the environment you live in. And it felt painful every day to see my sister have this fun bedroom that I didn't get access to. And it felt painful every day that I'd come home from school to an empty house because my parents were still at work, and my sister would be at her skating, or maybe I assume they were at skating with her, but I was told there wasn't enough money for me. So the majority of my life while in elementary, I spent alone in the basement. I'd come home after school and I'd eat a bunch of junk food and drink 2-liter soda pop straight from the bottle. I had no idea about nutrition. I didn't know how to make a healthy snack. Our cupboards were full of junk food. And I'd watch shows. I just watched TV alone, hour after hour after hour after hour. Like, TV was my life because my friends, like, I had a lot of friends, but when you're that young, you aren't really hanging out with friends every day after school yet. So it felt very lonely and isolating. I'd ask to play board games, with my parents. I asked to play with them, and the answer was always no. Sometimes I wouldn't know what to wear to school to get dressed in, and because no one was like dressing me, let alone feeding me, I would go into my mom's room and just like pick out her smallest shirt and wear it as my shirt. But then it actually like went down to my knees, and I actually just would go to school like that. It was pretty absurd, some of these things that I do. But again, I was resourceful. I really was. When my, I'm just seeing where there was a phase actually when I was trying to think here. There was a brief phase when I was, I think I was almost 8, or maybe I just turned 8, and I actually did get put into gymnastics after a lot of begging and pleading to do so. And I remember when my parents, they're either still together or they just got divorced, but I remember I'd walk to my friend's house, Jenny's house, after school. And because gymnastics was 4:30 to 8:30, it was important we had a snack. Or maybe it was a shorter session back then. And I was never packed a snack to eat at the girls' house. And I remember feeling so much shame and like embarrassed, and feeling like her mom is annoyed at me because I didn't bring a snack, because I know it made her mom feel like, oh, she has to feed me one, but it's my own parent's responsibility. And so it made me have this experience called parentification, where the child actually takes on the parent role in the family, because I had to develop this sense of like hypervigilance over like, oh, these adult things that you would normally rely on an adult to do. I realized like, oh, my parents don't have the ability to do it. And at this time, that's when, or like throughout elementary, a pattern of this parentification is I had to put so much energy to try to get simple things like forms from school signed, or like a fee included to go on a field trip. You know, you get like paperwork, you bring it home, you give it to your parent. I mean, I find out Nebby needs a fee for a field trip or a form signed. It's like done the same second I get the notice. And there was something that just seemed like no matter how much I like reminded my parents, they couldn't do that. And so multiple times I had to sit out for the school field trip in elementary, and this also happened in junior high, and I would just stay back sitting in the office. When my sister and I would get in fights and arguments, I remember that no matter what happened, you know, of course each sibling thinks they're right, but whenever I would speak the truth about what happened, there was never a experience where my parents believed me. And so no matter the fight or altercation, I got in trouble and I got sent to my room. It just felt like there was no chance of winning in this experience. When I was briefly put in gymnastics, I had my first competition, and I won gold on every event and then gold on the all-round. And I remember being confused why my mom seemed mad at me for it. I remember not understanding why it seemed like she was irritated at the success of that. But of course, I didn't have the faculties to process the reason why behind it. And, you know, through many decades to come, I was able to put the pieces together. I remember every little book fair that came to my school, I would desperately want to get a book. Especially in phases where I wasn't allowed to be in gymnastics, I wanted to be able to join a book club, but I was never allowed, not a single time throughout the whole course of elementary, to buy myself a book. So all the kids from my class would go, bring their change, pick out books, multiple books, posters of cats on them. I wanted desperately to get posters so I could put something on my walls to cover up the gluey wallpaper, but never was I permitted to do so. And I couldn't join the book club I wanted to because I needed to own a book to be part of the book club. There was one time at 8 years old that I was jumping on the trampoline at my neighbor's house, and I asked my sister to not double bounce me. I was scared if she did, I'd hurt myself. And then she did double bounce me, and I shot off the trampoline, and I broke my left elbow so bad that multiple bones fractured and I fully dislocated it. So it was like hanging outside its socket. And I was crying and I asked my mom to take me to the hospital. And as hard as it's to comprehend, my mom had resistance to take me to the hospital. It's like I had to convince her, even though my arm was completely like morphed. It was so hard to take her to take me to the hospital that she actually had to go to a neighbor's house and ask the neighbor, "Do you think I actually have to take her to the hospital?" And the neighbor looked shocked and said, "You absolutely have to get in the car and take her to the hospital or call the ambulance." Looking back, I tell myself maybe she was drunk and she didn't want to get a DUI. My sister didn't get any trouble for that incident, so it just further perpetuated this feeling of injustice that the same rules don't apply to me that apply to her. So it was this year, 8 years old, that the neglect I was experiencing in the home skyrocketed to a point that is going to be hard for a lot of people to believe. And that's why I've had such a hard time ever thinking I could speak about it out of the fear no one will believe me. This is where my second formative belief took place. My parents, in their divorce and how they coped with it, if there was a shred of participation in my life, it completely ended at that point. One night while my dad was in the backyard, this was probably like a couple weeks before he moved out, he asked me while drinking I still remember it clearly. I remember looking at the garden hose. I remember him holding an amber bottle of beer. I remember just wanting to somehow like be around him, be around a parent. And he said to me, "Why isn't your body like Jenny and Sasha's? Why aren't you skinny like them?" Those were two girls I was friends with who were quite skinny. I wasn't skinny because I had a cast on my arm after a very traumatic arm breakage, and there was only junk food in my cupboards. No one made me breakfast, taught me how to make my own breakfast. No one made my lunch, and I binged on junk food when I came home after school with no babysitter to be around me or monitor my food choices. But yet I was asked, why isn't my body like Jenny and Sasha's? Why aren't you skinny like them? I was so devastated, and this is where I implanted the dysfunctional belief system of I'm not enough. I have to change myself, and specifically my body, to be enough, to be loved, to be accepted. This is where my level of self-abandoning truly started. During elementary, so at this same time, around when my father moved out, my mom also humiliated me about attacking my shape and size, but in a passive-aggressive way. Rather than saying, "I think you're too chubby," and by the way, I wasn't fat, I was just chubby. It's like they're acting like I suddenly became obese, but there was like such obvious reasons for a bit of weight gain. But nevertheless, she said to me that she had company or someone had swung by the house and they saw me, and when they left, she told me, made it very clear that the company saw me and they saw how much weight I've gained, and they now think I'm chubby. And so in this passive-aggressive, covert, narcissistic way, she made me feel awful about my size. She didn't offer to prepare me breakfast or buy nutritious after-school snacks, knowing I'd be at home eating alone. She just shamed me and made me feel disgusting about my body size as an 8-year-old with a broken arm. During this time, I tried to entertain myself, and I'd often go to the park by myself. I would just get on my bike and ride around the neighborhood. Of course, no one knew where I was. No one monitored me. And one time at 8 years old, I was alone at the park with my cast, and I was attacked from like far out in the field. A police dog saw me, and he started sprinting toward me. He attacked me. I was running away from him when I saw him beelining toward me, and he ripped open my shirt and attacked me to the ground. He was a police dog, the police officer wasn't on duty. It was a police officer training his in-training German Shepherd. That's how this happened. So my arm cast looked like the thing that they bite and attack in training. The police later came to my house. This time I'm just living with my mom, and he apologized and brought me a ball cap. And he did voice his concern about me being at the park alone at such a young age. And I know time, like the era was different back then. This was 1993, this incident. But nevertheless, as he left, my mother scoffed at him, saying like something about like he had the audacity to question me not being at the park with you. So looking back, there should have been a lawsuit, but at the same time, I wouldn't have actually wanted one because the dog likely would have been put down. And so I'm glad that didn't happen. But the refusal to take like some level of accountability for the incident, it did something inside of me was like, why is she more focused on this police officer threatening her? Why isn't she worried about the injury I sustained, you know? So after these events and just feeling this like complete level of chaos in my home and this lack of acceptance based on my size, I started starving myself. I had complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Of course, like I wasn't actually diagnosed. I'm just a child surviving in this house. But a way that I was managing the PTSD that I was experiencing was by having hyper control over my food intake. And I also developed OCD. The OCD only lasted a year, but the food intake issue progressed and progressed and progressed until I had full-fledged anorexia. Anorexia is common in children who are victims of childhood abuse because it's a psychological disorder and it gives them a sense of control in an unsafe and unstable environment. The OCD is similar to that. So I did it for the sense of control, but there was also just like in my child's mind was I'll get skinny enough to be accepted because my parents think I'm disgusting. So during this time, while I'm like progressively starving myself, there's an amount of violence that seems to be increasing in the house. Like I always remembered growing up being spanked and things like that, but I didn't have like big incident memories beyond that. But around this time, other things started happening. I had a Blowdryer thrown at my face from across the room. I would have been 9, and my nose started to bleed and was gushing blood, and I was left there just covered in my blood in my bedroom. Another time I had canvas sneakers beat across my face and head, and I don't know if this was done in an alcoholic rage or if it was just done in how they were feeling about me at the time. You know, one time I was sent to an uncle's house, and I was told I was being sent there for being bad, and that my uncle was like gonna smarten me up or something like that. And I remember being taken into his bedroom, and I was very intimidated of this man, and he closed the door behind him and he sat me in a chair sternly and proceeded to reprimand me, talk down to me for being bad. He didn't ask me what was happening at home, and I had no idea, like he had no idea the neglect I was experiencing, the lack of parental contact or involvement. And then also, I know that he physically dealt with his children, so like he wouldn't have been concerned about like the Blowdryer incident, but nevertheless, it was this feeling of like, no one will believe the child. I'm like in a like quote unquote like unbelievable situation. And that's a core essence of being the family scapegoat, is it seems unbelievable because it actually doesn't make logical sense that there's a treatment you're experiencing simultaneous to a treatment your siblings having, you know? I remember one time waking up, and I would have been 7 at this time because my parents still lived together, but I remember waking up at the weekend and no one was home. And if you have a 7-year-old in your life and you just picture that 7-year-old waking up at your house tomorrow morning and no one telling them when you wake up, the house will be empty. You'll have no idea why and where everyone went. It will be Saturday. You'll think people should be home. But like, just imagine your 7-year-old just waking up to an empty house and like no understanding why the house is empty. That's what happened to me. And I had a panic attack. I thought I was abandoned. I thought everyone left me for good. It's like you have a brain that can't rationalize what could be the case. And a few hours later, everyone came home from my sister's skating practice. And rather than apologies, I was like reprimanded and shamed for being so, I guess, dramatic or sensitive. I was always told I was too sensitive. So I was shamed for having an emotional response to waking up to an empty house as a 7-year-old and staying in that empty house crying for 3 hours until someone opened the door again. I also remember when I was 9 years old and I was visiting my uncle for that experience of being told to smarten up. Because again, the scapegoat, you're given a reputation that you're this bad, defective person, and it bleeds out into the other family members' perceptions of you. But nevertheless, there was a powerful memory I had, and my aunt, she set up a craft at the table. She mixed like corn syrup with something, and it kind of made this gooey thing that was hard then soft, and my cousin and I played with it. And I remember being in complete shock and wonder because I couldn't believe her mom actually like spent time to make a craft for us to do. I had no memory of a parent giving me a craft or like something that is like I get to do something that's not the TV or just like playing alone. I had never, through memory at least, experienced that, and I remember going home from that visit thinking, oh my gosh, my cousin's the luckiest girl in the world. I can't believe her mom made her a craft to do. It was just something I had never known. There was parent-teacher nights, like there always are for children, and I remember my dad never came to one, never, like as if that would never happen, but there was 2 times I recall my mom being willing to come, and one of them was in grade 5. And this was the peak of my anorexia. So between the ages of like 9 to 10, I lost 18 pounds. I still had anorexia at 11, but it was getting better. Like I wasn't doing such extreme measures to be skinny, and there wasn't more weight to lose. But picture that, like 3,500 calories is a pound of fat. I was slightly chubby, and yet I lost 18 pounds and was 2 years older. I was skin and bone. I was so severely malnourished. And again, no one was packing me a lunch. I never ate breakfast. I was able to easily get away with being anorexic. And because I never ate dinner at a table, like I never ate a meal with a family member, that experience never happened in my life. Except for when my mom ended up getting a boyfriend and we'd have dinners where they lived in a different city. But that's later in this story. But in these formative years, if I ate, it's just in the basement alone. So whatever I'd bring downstairs to eat, let's say I brought a bowl of soup, I just pour it in the toilet. Maybe take a couple bites to like survive. Or I'd often just like make a sandwich. That was my most common dinner. My whole childhood is I'd make a sandwich or a bagel sandwich. And what I would do is when I'd come downstairs, for some reason, how I dealt with like how do I hide the food and not eat it is I'd actually just find a place in the basement and I'd hide it. And I remember feeling shameful about that. I remember thinking that's gross, but it wasn't as gross as the idea of me being chubby, so I did what I needed to do. So anyways, I'm in grade 5. I'm so skinny. I look so unhealthy. And my mom comes to the parent-teacher interview and she sees a photo of me on the wall and she says, she doesn't say, I'm worried about how you've lost 20 pounds the last year. She doesn't say, like, no parent ever spoke to me about my weight loss. It wasn't mentioned. So I just assumed they were like happy it was happening. But she saw the photo and she's like, oh my God, what are your teachers going to think of me? So seeing me skin and bone, screaming for help, screaming for parental attention, it didn't inspire her or my father to get me help, to get me to a psychologist, make me lunch, make me breakfast, talk to me about food, talk to me about why I'm hiding food in the basement. It didn't inspire that. The only thing it inspired was a comment about like, oh my God, what are the teachers going to think of her? And then being upset at me that the teachers are going to think awful of her. So it was either at 10 or 11 years old. Some of the food I was hiding, I put it in I remember this like black pleather purse in my basement. And rather than come and speak to me and open up a conversation about, why are you anorexic? What's this weird thing you're doing, hiding food or like putting it in the toilet? All that was done is the purse of rotten food that my sister found. It was, my mom put it, spread it out on my bed, the rotten food, on my pillow actually. Never spoke to me about it, just left me in this deep sense of shame and embarrassment. I'm completely traumatized at this point. I don't even know how to cope with what's happening. My sister shames me, calls me disgusting, makes fun of me. During those elementary years, I was offered zero help with homework. Not once did either parent ever ask me never was the phrase said, do you have homework? Or can I help you with homework? Or like any sort of involvement inquiry. So anything I did was just self-generated. I was naturally smart, so without studying, I actually somehow pulled off honors. On one single occasion, my mom did have to help by taking me to the public library because I needed to access a newspaper to complete a social studies assignment. And I remember thinking that parentification feeling of like, why is this so hard for her? Like, why is she so angry about this? Like, why does something all the other parents are doing for their kids make her so angry at me that this is like intolerable to putting in this effort to do this? And I just remember thinking this, like, I had this dream that like, I wish one day my parents could be like other parents, the way other parents just like know how to take care of their children. So during this time, there was phases where I was put back in gymnastics, taken out, not enough money, put back, taken out. Throughout it, my sister always maintained being enrolled in her sport. One memory that was particularly painful is we didn't have enough money for me to attend most of my competitions or even do the training. But sometimes when my sister had an out-of-town competition, I'd be driven and taken to her competition, and it would be the very weekend I actually had a competition that if I was like still with my gymnastics group, I'd be getting to compete in. So it felt like salt on the wound of, I'm not doing a sport, no one's honoring that I have dreams and desires, but I'm like being carted along to these out-of-town competitions for my sister and sitting in the stand like a good girl, watching her, clapping for her. And I would act out about this. I would cry, I would yell, I would scream. It felt so unfair. And I'd be communicated to, there's only enough for one child. Like only enough for one child to do their endeavor. Interestingly enough, there was enough for the nightly drinking, but not for enrollment in a sport. There wasn't enough for even a babysitter or being put in the after-school program at elementary that the other kids did whose parents weren't home after school. My sister wasn't home after school. She was 3 years older, so one might say that she could babysit me, but she went to skating after school, so I just came home by myself. Nevertheless, there was a phase in grade 6 when I was now back in gymnastics, but because I'm still in anorexia, I'm so malnourished. At this phase, due to lack of food, I'm blacking out regularly. I'd be at school and I'd pass out and like wake up on the tarmac. I'd be in public places and pass out and then like come to and find strangers like lifting me up. I once passed out in a friend's swimming pool and I drowned in the pool, went to an element of the other side. I didn't completely transition over, but then I came to and found myself like struggling at the bottom of the pool. And I remember that even though, like, so all those times I'd black out or drowned, I remember, like, a young child doesn't know any better. Like, they only know what they're raised in. So it didn't even occur to me, like, I didn't ever have the experience of you can go to a parent or a parent will, like, interact with you or help you. There was no, like, emotional support or connection of me having, like, human basic needs. So it didn't even occur to me. I never told my parents about the blacking out, and And even though I saw my mother on the day I drowned, it didn't even cross my mind to mention it to her. Like, that's how far removed my paradigm was of, like, you go to a parent for support. So when I was back in gymnastics in grade 6, I broke my foot due to how brittle my bones were. I was put in a walking cast that had a piece of rubber on the bottom, but it was not waterproof. It was a cast. And it was wintertime, and I had to walk in the snow with a cast to class. And there was even one time my class had to walk through a field and go somewhere in like deep, deep snow, and I had to walk and get my cast just absolutely saturated wet on this like freshly broken foot. And my parents knew this is how I got to school. Nothing had changed. I didn't suddenly have like a magical taxi show up. Like, they knew I had a cast. They knew I was walking to school. They knew casts aren't waterproof. But nevertheless, my cast became full of mold and fungus and smelled putrid. And I had friends who would laugh about how putrid smelling my cast was, and they'd be challenged to like come near it and smell it because it was that gross. I do recall the cast got so bad that eventually I was taken back to the doctor and it was cut off and I got a new one. But it really just shows an element of regard for some of my basic needs growing up in that home. 9 years old was the last year I had my birthday celebrated. I craved to have a birthday party. It meant so much to me. I would actually do like party planning in my head. I would envision like, oh, I'll make an obstacle course and these can be in the goodie bags and we can play these games. And I was very much into like planning the like fun elements of having a birthday party. But while I was living with my mother, I was never permitted to have a birthday party past the age of 9. And I was never permitted to have an Easter egg hunt past the age of 10. And at 10, it wasn't an Easter egg hunt. It was at my dad's apartment at the time that he lived in. And it was just like a handful of like some chocolate eggs. There wasn't this like Easter element of finding eggs. So the process of becoming an adult as a child happened to me certainly in the very young elementary ages, because things that are part of the childhood experience stopped. No Santa past being 5, no birthday past 9, no Easter past 10. The last Christmas I ever had with my dad, I was 15, and he was so angry at having to put up a Christmas tree, saying I didn't deserve one, and so he, due to like probably feeling he like somehow had to, even though he didn't want to, because he said I don't deserve one and he's not putting one up, but he begrudgingly put one up at 10 p.m. on Christmas Eve when I was 15. And that's the last Christmas I've ever spent with my father, but we'll get to how that relationship shifted and changed throughout the years. I was never bought a Halloween costume growing up, and I know sometimes if the family's poor enough, that's just what happens. But what was particularly painful about this situation is like I was willing to be creative. I'd go around the house and try and find something to throw together to be able to wear something, you know, like maybe find an old part of a costume my sister wore previously. I was willing to do that. I just wanted something. And sometimes my costumes were so like scrapped together of random things that I couldn't even say to kids at school like what I am, because it was just so random. I'm just like finding clothes that aren't even like costume clothes. So there was a lot of embarrassment and shame I was carrying. I was embarrassed for anyone to see my bedroom. I was embarrassed about my body. I was embarrassed about, you know, the casts on my foot or the casts on my arm. And there was more casts still to come as the years unfold. But I remember something started happening is like I truly ran out of ways to have a Halloween costume. And so I was told to wear my sister's skating outfits as what my costume is. This was particularly painful because I hated the fact that she got to be in skating and I was told only enough for her in skating, not me. And then to be told when other kids are dressing up as something fun and it makes Halloween feel exciting, I was told my dress-up costume is just her regular skating outfit. But yet I put it on so that I had something to wear and not be left out at the kids at school. Throughout elementary school, I experienced sexualization well before it was age appropriate. My father left porn magazines in plain sight. They were on a shelf in one of the rooms in the basement that were at my height to reach. So I started looking at them at 7 years old. So my curiosity about sexuality was way too soon, way too early. I'd read the graphic, like, sexual stories that were involved in these pornography magazines. The pornography magazines would be left in hampers. Like, there'd be a hamper beside the toilet, and I'd open up the hamper, and there'd be naked women. There was even weird, like, sexual cartoon books, like there, and those were actually in plain sight in the actual, like, part of our basement where toys were kept. In elementary, while living with my mom, while living with both parents, there wasn't a bedtime. Like, I didn't have a, like, if there was a bedtime, it would have been around the age of still having a babysitter, like 6. Maybe I still had a bedtime at 7, but when, like, all parental involvement went away was around the age of 8. And so I would stay up late. I would watch, like, primetime movies. I remember there'd be one on 9 to 11, there'd be one 11 to 1. And I remember once in a while I'd watch a movie that was on from 1 to 3 a.m. And then I'd wake up exhausted for school, obviously not have time to, like, make a lunch. I never did that. And so then I would just, like, sprint to school to get to class on time. I should also mention, during this phase of elementary, and again, this is, like, when I'm anorexic, I was striving to have this perfect physique. And so I'd come home at lunchtime, and rather than, like, stay at school and eat a packed lunch like my friends, I'd come home and I would obsessively exercise. I had a rule, 500 V-snaps per day. And if I ever broke the rule, I'd have to do extra the following day. So let's say Tuesday I was sick and I didn't do any. Wednesday I'd have to do 1,000. So the amount of effort my little child self was putting in to do whatever she thought was possible to be deemed enough and adequate, pretty enough, small enough, skinny enough to be accepted, it was actually at an extreme level of self-abandonment because of the level of parental abuse taking place. My mom started a relationship when I was 9 with her long-term partner, and they went on an overnight trip to Vegas. I don't recall how many nights they were there, but I was left at home with no babysitter overnight at 9 years old. Throughout growing up in this home, it felt like I was constantly being bullied by my older sister. Phrases that started being said to me as young as, like, probably grade 6 is that I'm a slut and I have no life and you're a loser and no one wants to be friends with you and you're a loner, or go get a life at Value Village, which is this secondhand shop. And it was this implication, like, I get the secondhand things, I get the secondhand life, she comes first. I'm a loser who doesn't do a sport, spends my time in the basement. And I felt hurt because no one would intervene and stop these comments. So it felt like an unspoken agreement that I'm this, like, despicable thing that doesn't deserve to be alive. During grade 4, 5, and 6, I actually started seeing my dad every second weekend as part of the post-divorce custody arrangement. And this was just part of custody arrangement. Like, you get divorced and so the dad spends some time with their child. And it doesn't seem like a lot every second weekend, but for me, it felt magical. It felt amazing because it was the first time a parent was spending time with me, but it was actually just like a byproduct of, like, custody, right? Because he never spent time with me before moving out. But during this time, I experienced a different kind of abuse. It's called parental alienation. So this is when one toxic parent speaks and shares to their child at a very inappropriate age and talks about the other parent in a way to ruin that child's relationship with that parent. So wanting me to develop hatred to my mother. So I already had valid reasons to not like my mother because of how hurtful my experience was with her. But he'd spend these visits just telling me every detail, how disgusting she is, what a slut she is, how everything's her fault, how she's ruined our family, how like she doesn't care about me, she only cares about her boyfriend. And he'd tell me every detail of their court case. And so I was like in this very stressful experience. But he also was telling my head that when he kicks her out of the house and moves back in, he'll save the day and he'll actually put me back in gymnastics, and it's her fault we don't have enough money. And when he moves back in, he'll get me in gymnastics. So very manipulative, very unhealthy, playing me like that. But I misinterpreted it as he was caring for me. We never did anything child-orientated on those visits. Not one single time did he take me swimming, to a park, or bike riding. The only experience I had was taken to the movie store, where no matter what, no matter my age, because again, I'm in grade 4, 5, 6 at this time, it was an adult rated R movie. And I specifically remember the sexuality. This is called non-physical sexual abuse, like all the porno I was exposed to. And then to be 9 years old, sitting on the couch watching R-rated movies where there's sex scenes. I remember it's stamped in my memory seeing this scene where this man gives oral sex to this woman. And it's like, why aren't we watching a family movie? Why aren't we picking out actually even a G movie, like a child movie, a movie made for a 9-year-old? It never occurred to me why we weren't. I was just enjoying the experience of being with someone. When we weren't doing that, I remember just being left in his apartment and I don't know where he'd go. Once in a while, I'd be brought with him to the golf course where he'd go with a friend of his named Dennis. And I thought that was spectacular. Here I am at a golf course, right? Being outside felt better than being inside. There was a time frame before I was taken out of gymnastics again. I was in either grade 5 or grade 6, and payment hadn't been made to my gymnastics coach, and the session was 4:30 to 8:30, and rather than calling my mom or my dad saying payment hasn't been made, she can't keep coming to class, I was humiliated by being walked up to on the gym floor and in front of all my friends, being told what happened and being told I had to leave the gym club. This man's name was Mr. Arsenault. He was Montreal French Canadian, and I always had a bad feeling about him, but it later came out all of the sexual abuse claims that were filed against him from other gymnasts that he used to coach when he lived in Montreal before moving to Edmonton. And it's interesting that I didn't know concepts of sexual abuse, but I did know I had a spidey sense activation that something makes me feel really uncomfortable around this man, and this feeling like he's lingering, and he'd talk about how he thought I was pretty and that gymnasts can only go far if they're pretty like me. He'd say shit like that to me. So I just had to throw that in there, that's who that person was. His name's Michel Arsenault, and never let your kids do gymnastics with him. He's not allowed to practice being a coach anymore, but nevertheless. He sent me off the mat, and I sat for almost 4 hours in the stands, humiliated, full of tears in my eyes that I wasn't allowed to train, but that everyone knew that I was the poor kid. Neither parent came to get me. I waited for another parent to carpool me home. Devastated when I came home, no one said, "I'm sorry that happened to you." Whenever there was a challenge, the reaction in my house was to get mad back at the person expressing emotions. So me being sad about it, I got in trouble, as if I somehow did something to cause the situation. I remember, this is the last memory I'm going to share about elementary, and then I'm going to take a big break. I remember in grade 6 when my dad would pick me up for the every second weekend visits, I would sit with my legs held tightly together in the passenger seat to ensure he didn't think my thighs were too fat, because if you relax your thighs, they spread out and look wider. I would also tell him, I packed a piece of bread already in my backpack and I'll eat that for dinner, so don't worry about feeding me. So he wouldn't. Like, some of these stories, they're hard to believe, and they're actually hard to still believe to this day. Hi there, guys. This is Christine popping in. I'm recording this outro a few days after I recorded this first of a 2-part series. And I want to thank you. Thank you for holding space and hearing my story and giving voice to my inner child. I realized upon finishing the recording, I didn't really get to the pinnacle experiences of the father wound, which was the whole intro, what this broadcast was to be about. And so I invite you to listen to the second part of the 2-part series. I've already recorded it, and it's if there was only one episode that I'd invite you to listen to, it would be the second part. The second part, I'm going to be walking you through my experience being 12 to 16 and the series of events that took place while living specifically with my father, and how things escalated to physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, emotional abuse, and what the experience really looked like, the scenarios that were at play living with someone who was a psychopath, had Machiavellianism and high-grade narcissism, how I became the target of the household now that my mother was no longer living with him, and how it basically culminated to a point where police removed me from my house at the beginning of grade 11, and I lived the next 2 years with a foster family who really gave me a beautiful example of what a family is and how I did deserve to be treated. And so I really encourage you, if you've made it this far, you got to listen to the next episode. And it ends on a really positive note. You're going to learn about how I found healing, how I found forgiveness, how I was able to change my life and leave this situation in the past and actually overcome some of the formative subconscious imprints that were implanted that was causing me to perpetuate a pattern in terms of the kinds of romantic patterns I was attracting into my adult life, and how I was able to be the change maker, the ancestral pattern breaker in my lineage for alcohol abuse, and how I was able to then go on and become the mother to my own daughter and mother her in a way that I never got the opportunity, but now that she'll have that in such a different environment, there's going to be a different pattern sent forward onto her lineage and the lineage after that. And so again, I really invite you to listen to the next episode. Sending you all so much love, and thanks again for hearing my story.